Okay. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me this time?
Yes, definitely.
Awesome. Awesome. And you're going to put up my PowerPoint for me, right?
Yep, it's already up.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
I'm not seeing it, so that's why. Okay. I'm still seeing the previous presentation.
Yeah, you might have a bit of a delay. So.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, I just wanted. Yeah, got it. All right. Well, thanks everybody for sticking around. I really appreciate it. I apologize for the need to make you stick around for another half hour, but I do appreciate it. And I wanted to say thank you to everybody for. It's been very interesting as I've listened to the presentations today. And so my goal in the next 20 minutes is simply to give you an introduction to a topic that a lot of people don't typically know a great deal about. And I think that's my overall message is really it's a history that there's more to it than people know. A lot of people today tend to think about women's baseball as something, it's associated with the 1940s and 50s, the All-American League, or current present-day baseball, right? As if this is all something new. And Deb Shattuck actually makes this argument really well if you want to read a great book called Bloomer Girls, where she argues that it's really now women returning to the game because they've always been there as fans and as players. And today we're going to focus primarily on the issue of players. But, for example, she points out in another article she wrote that there are over 60 teams that have been identified playing in just New York State alone between the 1850s and the end of the century. So one state, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And so the real question becomes, why don't we know about it? What are some of the issues? And as a historian, I always look at context, right? And so part of it is simply the attitude of the 19th century towards women participating in anything strenuous and seeing it not as something women were supposed to do. But baseball falls into a special category because it was a very manly sport. And so the idea that women were going to participate in that, certainly not something that most people saw as something women should be doing. Bigger issue is, of course, you have to know what you're looking for when you go back into the 19th century. It's interesting to look at the different names that teams were given. Reds and blues, blondes and brunettes. The advertisement that you're looking at says Bloomer Girls. That's actually the most well-known name that most people would associate. There's also college teams, and there are individuals who are going to play on men's teams. Harper's Weekly in 1859 starts out with one of the first mentions of both genders playing baseball. The Philadelphia Age in 1865 talks about a ladies' baseball club, and the list goes on. The other issue, of course, is this question of looking back, and some people, a lot of it because of the newspapers and the newspaper coverage, see 19th century women's baseball as really not serious, as more entertainment, as more vaudevillian, just for fun, ridiculous spectacle, that kind of thing, and not really recognizing that there were really two aspects of women's baseball. There certainly was that vaudevillian element, as we're going to see, but there was also this sense that there were honest-to-goodness good ball players out there, and they played some decent baseball. But on the entertainment side of it, just to give you a couple of examples, New York Times, August of 1883, published an article entitled A Ridiculous Exhibition, talking about a women's baseball game. A month later, in September of 83, they published another one called A Baseball Burlesque. And think about that language, right? And so hard to see that any differently. If we could move to the next slide, that would be great, because we're going to look at one of the challenges to that idea, which is certainly the notion of the college teams. Okay, I'm not sure what happened to my slide presentation. It seems to have gone away, but I can continue to talk about it. We're talking about the college team, which is the Vassar Resolutes. The Vassar Resolutes is a team that looks at the idea of playing for college, playing with the opportunity to see people and see opportunities for girls to play. And so what you have is the Vassar team, followed by a couple of other college teams. So by the Vassar Resolutes were founded in 1876. Not the first college team put into the mix. They were a college team that showed that by the 1870s and 80s, there were about 20 college teams participating. And so that's the kind of thing that starts to happen. And so that is how things begin to change. The first two college teams at Vassar were the Laurels and the Abenakis. That's what's actually on my slide that you can't see. The Laurels and the Abenakises, just groups of girls. Baseball at college level was seen as something not serious, seen as something for just anybody to play, as long as nobody could see them, and that was the real key. But the real problem was the charlatans, the male owners, male promoters, and the most notorious of all those was a gentleman by the name of Sylvester Wilson. Sylvester Wilson was a charlatan, it's the best way to describe him, but he owned and promoted a number of teams, probably more than anybody else in the latter part of the 19th century, under a whole variety of aliases. And that's part of the problem. He was constantly being run out of town for his inappropriate interactions with young ladies. He often would abscond with the money that a team made and leave them high and dry, and they'd have to find their way home. This added to the idea that women's baseball was certainly not something that you wanted your young daughters to be involved in, that good people got involved in, and so that's a real problem. Now, contrast to that, there are a whole bunch of ads that come out, starting in 1883, that I had one that showed you this idea of calling them the young ladies team, but also talking about really emphasizing the moral qualities and the good nature of what was happening, to try to encourage people to see women's baseball as something other than just entertainment and a spectacle. And so there's a quote that comes out from a magazine called The World, and it says, when they started out, when women first picked up the ball, they didn't pitch very well, they couldn't catch, they couldn't do any, but those things were improving. And so the recognition that with some practice and with some training, women were able to start to make some differences in the quality of play and things like that. And I think that's an important consideration. Women didn't get many opportunities, so they didn't get the same opportunities even that young boys did to be able to practice and things like that. And so that particular newspaper ad certainly makes that very, very clear that that kind of thing is going on. There's also a sense that you had to promote the women's game in order to get people to come, and so most people came out of curiosity. So in 1890, our friend Sylvester Wilson puts out a big ad, and it talks about the belles of the ball game, the queens of the diamond. It talks about them with this idea that they see themselves as, how do we put this? They see themselves as they're supposed to be above the fray, above, and yet in the same ad he talks about it as attracting as many people as a circus. He mentions that they're going to play a vaudevillian troupe, and so he talks about this very, again, caricature of baseball. And so that's the kind of thing that you see. Now, at the same time, we also know that women's baseball began to expand, and we see not only all the college teams playing, but also African Americans. And so there is a African American team called the Dolly Vardens, and the Dolly Vardens are an interesting team. The Dolly Vardens, African American, and they played in 1883 in Philadelphia. There were two Dolly Varden teams, named for a character in Charles Dickens' novel, but they were only referred to as the Dolly Varden Ones and the Dolly Varden Twos. And so there's another problem with following women's baseball, right? You had to rely upon the newspapers. There's no distinction between those two teams. Sometimes there aren't very many articles, but they might just refer to them as the Dolly Vardens, and so you didn't know which team you were looking at. Sometimes they only referred to female players by their first names, so it might be Miss Ella, Miss Sue, that kind of thing, as opposed to their actual names. With the Dolly Vardens, we do know that Ella Harris was their captain and their pitcher. We actually have a roster that includes a couple of Johnsons and Ella Thompson at catcher, another Ella playing center field, those kinds of things. But we don't have much more information about them. There's a lot of articles that you can find online about the Dolly Vardens, and they always show a picture that is actually not of the Dolly Vardens. It's actually a much later YWCA team, and it's not the Dolly Vardens at all. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, at the same time, we also see that there are individuals who come along to play for that dominate on some of the bloomer teams. The bloomer teams are the most well-known and probably the strongest players. You had the blondes and the brunettes, and the reds and the blues before that. The reds and blues were simply identified usually by the color of their socks or their stockings, and then the blondes and brunettes would just simply take on those names. You didn't have to be a blonde or a brunette. So sometimes they did wear wigs, adding to that vaudevillian kind of approach. But the Boston Bloomers, probably the most well-known, and their best player was Maud Nelson. Maud Nelson started her career at the age of 16 in 1897, pitched and played through 1922 when she retired. And then she continued to manage and own a team through until her death in 1944. She originally came to this country as a child. She was born actually in Austria. Her original name was Clementina Breda, and there was one of her problems in terms of becoming an easy player to follow and for newspapers to pick up on. Sometimes she went by the name Breda, sometimes she went by Nelson, sometimes the papers misspelled it as Nielsen. Later she got married, and so sometimes it was Olson, because John Olson was her husband. But in 1897, there's an interesting article as the Boston Bloomer girls went out west, and they actually traveled all over, and they ended up in San Francisco, and they beat the San Francisco Athletic Club 14-13. And the article focuses almost exclusively on the errors that the team made, the drop ball, the tripping, the pure spectacle, and then says, but the only reason they won is because of the stellar pitching of Maud Nelson and her fielding. Because Maud would also, typically in late innings, essentially move over to third base for defensive purposes, which is pretty amazing to think about. And then she continued on, as I said, to pitch for a team called the Western Bloomer Girls. She's going to be involved with the New York Bloomer Girls. One of the big ads for the Western Bloomer Girls talks about the team as moral and refined. Again, focusing on that, we've got to get people past this idea that this is a bad thing for women to do. They also talk about it's okay to bring all the ladies. And again, think about what Major Organized Baseball was doing late 19th century to improve their image by encouraging ladies' days and things like that. There were lots of other teams that start to develop all over the country. There's a team in Denver, Colorado that actually has a train car that they use to advertise on the side, the team coming into various areas, which is really kind of cool. By 1900, there's an interesting quote in a North Dakota newspaper talking about the Bloomer Girls traveling all over the country. and finding themselves coming out west, and that this team is a stellar team for people to come out and watch. They are moral, they are refined. You can bring out the ladies, but they also mention that they have their own grandstand and a fence. And of course, when you add a grandstand and a fence, you're talking about being able to make money by that point, and maybe seeing it a little more serious. And of course, this won't be the first time in 1900 that fans would pay money to see a women's baseball game. That actually comes in 1875, so we go back 25 years to Springfield, Illinois, a team between blonde and brunettes. Blondes happened to win 11-7, and they charged money. Newspaper describes the girls as reputable, and even says that some of them had aptitude towards the game. And so you can see the kind of language being used by newspapers and things like that. But the women's game was certainly, under the Bloomer idea, would seem to suggest it was improving. Probably the most famous single individual player of the day was Lizzie Arlington. Lizzie Arlington, originally known as Elizabeth Stroud, sometimes also spelled Elizabeth Stride, from Pennsylvania, pitcher, got her chance when she used to play ball with her brothers, and she was discovered by William Connor, who thought she would make a great promotion for his teams, and he wanted to pay her about $100 a week. And so he thought that this would be a good idea. Her most famous incident, the very short career, in July of 1898, July 5th to be exact, where she's going to play a game for the Reading Coal Heavers. They actually win the game 5-0, and she's brought in the ninth inning to pitch the last inning. And that's what the newspaper article says. The actual headline says, "Woman in the Box." They estimated about 1,000 fans were there, many of them to see her out of curiosity. They wanted to see what she looked like. They weren't too sure about this. The advertisement shows her in a dress, not bloomers, but not a long dress. They had shortened the dress. In her one inning of pitching, she gave up 2 hits and a walk, but then retired the side with no runs being scored, so no damage was done. Afterwards, some newspapers talked about her having some potential. Others said they didn't really think she was going to go very far because she wasn't very strong. Her pitching was pretty slow. They just didn't see opportunities there, and she doesn't continue on. Her name disappears off the sports pages pretty much after that game in 1898. But that's seen as one of the first in a organized professional game like that. And so we kind of start with this idea of the early college teams. They can play as long as they're not seen. There's actually a story told about one of them where the teams were playing and they were told that they could play as long as nothing got broken. And they weren't talking about arms and legs, because one of the girls hit a ball through a window and it got broken, and school closed the baseball games down. So it was that idea that as long as they played by society's rules, and that contributed to sort of the overall attitude. And by the end of the century, we are seeing individual young women playing on men's teams, just as there were men who played on the women's teams. Bloomer teams often had 2 men, pitcher and a catcher, considered to be the 2 most important positions that women couldn't play. And they were not strong enough for those, and the teams had to have. Occasionally you would read about a topper, and that would be a man who would dress in the women's clothing. Men didn't have to play on, but some of them did. So that just gives you a little bit of a view of what baseball looked like for women in the 19th century. So I'm going to stop there, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Go ahead, caller.
had a question, Leslie. My name is Paul Langendorfer from the Victory Baseball Club of Rochester, New York. Can you just give us a brief overview of the difference between, right now we think of women and softball, and where did softball evolve, or how did it break off from where the baseball we're learning about now? Just as an overview, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I didn't really talk about, because softball was really introduced right at the end of the 19th century. It comes out in the 1890s in Chicago originally, and it was originally designed for men to play. And the idea was they were looking for something indoor when they couldn't play outdoors. And actually, one of the original names of softball, which is kind of interesting, it tells you a lot, was called kitten ball. And so kitten ball was, as you could sort of get the idea, but it was originally designed that way. And then early on, it was also thought that it should be played by men who were kind of no longer able to play baseball, didn't necessarily have the skill level, etc. And so that's kind of how it got its start. It begins to branch off really in a significant fashion to the idea that it becomes the alternative for women really when Little League is created, because as early as the 1930s, when we see Little League come in, that's where you really start to see that differentiation with the idea that now you've got an alternative and there's a way to separate those two. And that certainly has increased over the years. So just as a big, quick brief, that's kind of where it came from.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
You are most
Thanks
welcome.
again, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you. You too.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Hi, Leslie. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question that's very similar to Paul's, but I'm going to branch it a little bit. When we're talking about baseball as the way that we understand it to have been played in the 1860s and 70s, did women have any different rules? The reason I kind of bring it up is, as far as I have ever been told, or as I have ever found it, the earliest known mention of a women's baseball game for me is about 1865, 66. And I'm just curious if women ever played during the bound era, and if there were any differences in the rules between men and women in the way that the game was played.
Yeah, and that's a really tough question to answer, because unfortunately what we don't know a lot about is they didn't have any real organization, so they don't have any written rules. And so we certainly can't answer from that respect. So the best thing we can do is piece together what's either in diaries or what little bit newspaper articles typically talk about. And unfortunately, they don't say a whole lot often about the games themselves. They're much more interested in talking about how they dressed, what their uniforms look like, what their caps look like, that kind of thing. So the best thing that we can say is that, and this is what I think contributes to a lot of, and not inaccurately, that it's really more of a spectacle, that women weren't able to handle some of the, certainly playing the way men would have, right? But we do know, for example, that certainly by the time the bloomer teams really start to come in towards the end of the 19th century, late 1880s, 1890s, that it's clear by some of the articles that they are playing by very similar rules.
Okay. And then, if I may, do you have any evidence, any suggestion that potentially some rules may have extended from a particular time point because perhaps the previous rules may have been a little bit more suitable for, I don't know how to say it delicately, just women to play? Like, for example, the bound rule. Do you think that there's any potential that they may have been playing the bound rule much longer than men, in 1864 or 5 or when I
Yes. Oh, I definitely. I mean, certainly newspaper articles would suggest that, because you're still seeing articles talking about women catching it in their skirts. and that's clearly from a bounce, right? Into the late 1870s, things like that. So, and whether that was intentional or just simply that was the easier way for them to play, it made more for more entertainment. That's hard to say, but that was definitely still going on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Leslie. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, at this point, that concludes our presentation. And I've got some closing remarks by our chairman, and I'm going to move forward with that. And thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you for joining today's Vintage Baseball Association free 2020 Go Live Sports live stream. Thanks to Rudy Frias of the Vintage Baseball Podcast and Kelly Rinney of Go Live Sports for their help with this production. We would like to know what you thought about it. We hope to provide more live streaming events in the future. For the love of the game, this is Gary Shipacassi, President of the Vintage Baseball Association.